Good to go. Hi, my name is Kenneth Refutation. Today I'm going to be refuting Thomas Farrell's claim that GMO foods are nutritionally equivalent to non-GMOs, but have advantages that non-GMO foods cannot provide, and are likely one of our greatest tools to secure the future. To secure the future. He supports this proposition with three supporting claims. The first being that GM food is nutritionally equivalent to non-GM food. The second being that GMOs have advantages over non-GMO foods. And then that humanity's future lies with GMO foods. In response to his claim number one, I would like to point out that my opponent only quoted the abstract of an article that he was using as evidence. Had he actually read further in this article, about 4 paragraphs later, there's actually a point that mentions that the evidence that they accumulated on 100 billion animals over the course of 30 years was not enough to provide evidence to show that GMO foods had a negative or a positive impact on the animals. It goes on to explain that they were not able to feed the animals enough of the GMO food to have an impact on the animals. Had they fed them one type of food, it would have deprived them of a certain nutrient that they needed, so they needed to kind of have an assortment of the foods that they fed them. So to counter his second point, by my opponent's definition, he defined GM foods as those that are created in a lab with modern science. However, with this definition, his second supporting claim is nullified. Claiming that GM foods are more advantageous than non-GM foods is a wrong assumption, because the traits that they use to make these new GM foods have been brought forth from already existing plants. He used the example of a potato that was that grew in South America that had resistance to the late blight of potatoes. However, claiming that GM foods have these advantages that GM foods have is wrong. The plants already existed, so basically they were just crossbreeding. A quote by Dr. Helen Wallace, director of the campaign group Gene Watch. She says, "It is possible to breed these blight-resistant potatoes using conventional methods, so there is no need to use GM technology." And lastly, to respond to his last claim, he makes a hasty generalization in his last claim, saying that GMOs are the future for food production. However, before we can really begin to alter the foods that we are going to be using for human consumption, we need to be able to map their entire genome, and that takes 5 to 10 years. There's a quote here by the plant pathologist and potato breeder at Cornell University, Walter de Jong. He says the one problem with conventional genetic engineering techniques is that they add genes unpredictably. It's impossible to control just where the gene gets added, and sometimes they end up in a spot where it can be expressed, sometimes they end up in a spot where it can be expressed effectively, and sometimes it does not. He goes on to explain that the genomes of potatoes have not been completely mapped, and it is difficult to use more advanced methods to change their genes to something more favorable. He used the evidence of this potato a lot in his argument, but he didn't really have any other evidence supporting the fact that they would be our future for food production, or that they are more advantageous than normal foods. In conclusion, I feel that I have successfully refuted his argument by showing that his first supporting claim is void due to lack of reading the rest of the article and using the support or the evidence there that would have nullified his argument. Secondly, his second claim is void because he only uses one example of a plant that is slightly more advantageous than other plants that are already on the market, but the plants already existed. And lastly, because I proved that there's a lot more work that needs to go into GM food making for the future of food production, I feel like he really did not prove his point all that well. And that's it.
All right, structural stuff at the beginning is good. The challenge on the first point because of the problem with the evidence I thought was pretty effective, although, it seems like there's a, that there's a reason that it undermines the research that they didn't feed all of these animals just a particular kind of food. I'm not exactly sure that we can reach the conclusion that the research is unreliable. It's just that it's incomplete. And so I think that that's what you need to say. You go through this process in a couple of the points where you kind of explain the evidence, kind of explain what your reason is, and then don't really make the claim as clearly as it should be made. I thought that was especially true on the next point, where your argument basically is we can achieve this objective without genetic modification. That's the claim. But you go through a whole bunch of stuff that explains all this stuff before you even say anything close to that, and I think you should still be saying that pretty clearly. So the analysis and the evidence that you have, I think, is the good, it's good evidence and it's the right analysis, but you're missing being able to effectively pick out the argument and showing it to us a little bit more directly, especially in an oral presentation. You got to be very direct in expressing that. So if I was reading this as a paper, it might work a little bit better, but you need to be more effective at moving the claims to the forefront, stating them in declarative ways, and then giving your explanation instead of kind of backing into the argument. I thought you did that on both the first and the second points. The third point seems to be that there's problems with the genetic mapping. I think our argument simply here is we have insufficient data to reach these conclusions. There's your claim. And how do we know that? Well, because we haven't even completed the mapping of the potatoes that they're trying to do this with, and all kinds of weird things can happen while they're doing the genetic manipulation. So I'm not saying it's dangerous, I'm not saying it's safe, I'm just saying we don't know. And that's the claim here. So I just think that the claims are getting buried, so to speak. In the newspaper business, you're burying the lead. All right, thank you.